All right, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is a brief, slimmed down session of ones that I've done previously at other Cisco Live events, focusing on using Ansible to enforce device compliance inside of your network. I won't cover everything because of the shorter session. This is 30 minutes instead of the normal 45, but I will include a QR code as well. To the repository with all of the code that you can then download and play with on your own. The best part about this is I use a DevNet sandbox, so you don't need to have any infrastructure on your own. You just need to download the code and follow some of the examples and things that I've done against the DevNet sandbox. So you can use this at your leisure and explore more of the things that I'm not able to cover because of the condensed time period. So before I get started, my name is Quinn Snyder. I'm a Senior Technical Advocate with Learning and Certifications. We're responsible for all of the certifications across all of the tracks. So from the traditional routing and switching and data center and collaboration to our DevNet specializations, as well as our cyber ops. I've spent most of my time working in automation, and hence I'll be talking about Ansible today. So before I get started, we'll talk about what device compliance normally is and how we can use Ansible, not just to enforce a configuration, but all of the different elements that exist when we think of what compliance could be. So we'll cover about what I mean by that. We'll talk about the topology, and then most of this session will be hands-on lab. So I'll be driving and showing the output of these Ansible playbooks that I've created to show you how you can use Ansible in a variety of different ways in order to achieve that compliance that we talked about earlier. And then, like I said, I will provide the QR code for you to be able to download this code as well. So compliance. Most people think of compliance as enforcing a configuration baseline. I have these sets of things that I want to ensure are on all of my routers and switches. Logging, time zone, SNMP, the things that operationalize our network. Those are very important, and we don't want those to drift. Usernames, passwords, those kinds of things. However, if we take a look at compliance, we can also include those other things that I've included down below. Configuration archival and storage, using Ansible to create backups. Selective application of configurations to devices. So maybe I have only a set of devices that I want to change. I don't need to change them across the entire environment. How can I do that with Ansible? So selective configuration application. Submittal of config for change advisory board approval. How many have a change advisory board where you have to submit configurations to a release manager? It has to get approved before you can make the changes. A lot of people struggle with automation in that regard because you can't give a change advisory board an Ansible playbook and say, here, this is the configuration I'm going to be changing. They want to see the Cisco iOS output before, so they know what's going on. However, we can use Ansible to render our config for us so that we can use the same playbook to both apply the automation configuration, but also have it generate the config so that we can write that in our change advisory or our process documents for approval. So we can use Ansible in that. And then configuration deltas from a baseline. What I mean by that is if we've changed some config or config has been changed, we can see how far that configuration has migrated or moved between our baseline before we apply those configuration changes. So all of these things can fall under the umbrella of compliance, and we can use Ansible to enforce all of these pieces. So why would we use Ansible for this task and not some of the other tools that we've maybe used, whether it's spreadsheets or using some comparison between text documents or diff? We use Ansible because it's declarative. There's a lot of things on the internet that say Ansible is procedural. It is not. It is declarative. I don't write in Cisco iOS syntax inside of my playbook. I write in Ansible format the tasks that are declared with, Ansible modules and variables and outputs and states. That is declarative. I'm letting Ansible interpret my intent and translating that to a configuration. However, it's declarative at each task, and this is where it differs from things like Terraform. The example that I give to folks is when you're configuring a VRF on an interface. If you apply an IP address before the VRF, that IP address will be removed. That's the procedure, the step-by-step nature that you have to apply. Ansible's the same way. Ansible, if I write a playbook, Ansible does not know that I need to apply a VRF configuration before an IP address. I have to know that. So I still need to make sure I have a smooth flow from A to B, but within each task, I don't need to write the specific syntax. I write in YAML format. Ansible is idempotent, which means it's just a fancy way of saying I can run it many, many, many times. It will only apply the change the first time, and if there is no configuration changes, it will just say nothing has been changed and move on. So it doesn't matter how many times I run that playbook, I will only achieve the desired outcome once. It won't keep adding configurations. You won't have like thousands of lines of ACL entries that are duplicated over and over. You'll just see that once. With the new modules within Ansible, we have this state declaration, and I'll show you what that means in a second. But we can apply and remove configuration very quickly. Within each Ansible task, there is a state. State rendered, state merged, state replace, state delete. I can use the same playbook to apply a configuration and to delete it just by changing that state. So it's very easy to move back and forth between my desired configuration. And then finally, Ansible does support things like conditional matching, and I'll show how we use that. We can create templates and do partial playbook runs using tags for our individual tasks. And all of this, I may not get to all of this, but I will get to enough where you'll hopefully want to see more of it and play with the code on your own. So today we'll explore Ansible 2.10 and above. If you have not used Ansible in previous, since it's been, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, there are some modules that need to be downloaded. In order to make Ansible communicate with your Cisco devices, you have to download those collections. We'll talk about configuration backup, variable precedence, where we can store variables and how they can conflict with each other, tagging your tasks, and configuration rendering. That's probably all we'll get to today, but there is some additional stuff that we'll talk about with roles, how to use tags with roles, and then configuration diffs. But like I said, I probably won't get to that today. For our topology, I'm just using a DevNet sandbox. So there's a Cisco Modeling Labs sandbox that you can reserve with a default topology that is slightly larger than this. However, the important parts are there where I have 2 routers and 2 switches. So I have 2 iOS XE devices, 2 NXOS switches. Those are my targets that I'll be automating against. And all of the inventory files are pre-built for this sandbox. You can make this work in any environment that you want just by changing the inventory. But the repository that I will give you will have all of those things pre-configured for this environment. So I'm going to pause. This is if you want to take a picture of this, this is the QR code for the lab. You don't need to follow along, but at least have that for reference if you'd like to play with this later on. It will take you to my GitHub repository with all of the code where all of this sits. There is a README with instructions on how to use it, where to find the sandboxes and things like that. I do need to make an update, which I'll probably do after this session, to include a link to my Cisco Live presentation a couple of years ago in Melbourne when I actually did a full walkthrough of this in front of an audience. So you can see the steps there as well. So now that the cameras, I think, are down, let's jump into the lab. Okay. So for this, I'm just using a Visual Studio Code. So I have my files over on one side, I have my terminal down below, and I have an editor up above. I want to step through a couple of defaults that are included with this configuration so you're familiar with it before you get started. I've included an Ansible.cfg. This Ansible.cfg is nothing fancy. I'm setting that my host key checking is false, so it does not matter if we don't have valid SSH keys for these. These 3 items here, my inventory, my roles path, and my collections path. I like to have multiple folders that I may do slightly similar things, and I don't want my collection version or my inventory to bleed over across my projects. So what these 3 things are doing is say my inventory file is local in this inventory file. All roles and collections will be placed in my project folder under the roles or collections folder. In fact, if I scroll up, you can see that I have a roles folder and I have a collections folder. So look to that local folder for those things. Don't look anywhere else on your system. I have some SSH things here, which are just kind of defaults that I use. But let's dive into the inventory so you can see where the special sauce is there. So in my inventory file, I have a few things. With Ansible 2.10, we have to define our network CLI as our connection process. And I've defined my user and my password, as well as the local Python version in the virtual environment that I'm running. Ansible is based on Python. It's good practice with Python to ensure that you have a virtual environment for that specific version of Ansible and the Python dependencies for it. So use the local virtual environment. You can see that I have this VNV down here. That's my virtual environment. I have two iOS XE devices, .175 and .176. And I have some variables here for those iOS XE named devices. The thing that I want to highlight here is this Ansible network OS equals cisco.ios.ios. I have to tell Ansible what kind of device I'm connecting to. It does not know ahead of time. So I use that the Cisco iOS, and it will reach out and say, I'm going to connect to this device, knowing that's iOS, and here's the prompts that I expect back for user exec, privilege exec, conf t, those kinds of things. It knows how to handle that connection. This will also become important when I do conditional matching that I'll get onto a later playbook. Likewise, for NXOS, I have 177 and 178. And I have this Ansible network OS that's cisco.nxos.nxos. Again, that says that these are Nexus devices. Expect Nexus-style prompts and returns. And we can use that for conditional matching. I've then created a parent group called all pods, where if I want to reference all pods or all devices, I can simply say all pods in my hosts, and it will affect both iOS XE and NXOS. And that will come into play when I talk about, if I have a chance to talk about the roles, but you'll see that in the configuration where I reference all pods. Are we clear so far? Everything good? Okay. So I'll start off with a test just to make sure that in the 5 minutes that I have been up here that nothing has failed. I'm going to test connectivity. So this is that 99 test.yaml. All I'm doing is gathering facts. So by default, Ansible has some fact playbooks that are built into it. Normally we disable those because of a habit that they weren't included with Ansible. However, I just want to see, can we gather information from these devices using the specific iOS and NXOS facts? So I have iOS XE facts and NXOS facts. I'm going to gather the configuration of those things. And what's important here is this statement, when. This means that only run this task, only gather those facts when the device in the inventory matches Cisco iOS. So it will not use the NXOS connection method on an iOS XE device. Likewise, when we get into the configuration pieces, those two things will need to be separated because iOS syntax is different than NXOS syntax. So we need to separate those. We can, instead of having two different playbooks, we can match things in a single playbook using that conditional match. So I'm going to run this and hopefully it doesn't make a liar out of me. So I'm just doing Ansible playbook 99 test.yaml. I like the -VV. In Ansible, you can set 0 through 4 Vs, which will give you a length. More Vs means more verbosity, which means more words. I like to talk, so I like to see a lot of information come out. So I'm just going to run that and make sure we have some connection. I will say this will look slightly different on my screen than it will for yours because normally these things would be yellow or red or green. I have a color blind. I can't see certain colors, so I have this set so it will look different. I can see the differences in colors, and it looks different for you, but so that you can see those things there. Everything is okay. We were able to reach out and gather all those configurations, so our devices are still alive. So let's move on to our backup. Simple task for compliance. Before we make any changes to our network, we want to make sure that we have a baseline configuration to work from. This is the simplest task you can run in Ansible. All we're doing is we're going to back up our configuration. we're going to use the iOS config with the backup option. It's going to create a directory for each device in this folder called backup and the inventory host name. I didn't give host names, I just have IP addresses, so we'll see 4 IP addresses that are nested there. And each folder will hold this initial running config.cfg. But again, I'm doing that conditional matching because we need to know if it's an iOS XE or an NXOS device. So I'm going to run this. Playbook, 10 backup.yaml. I'm just going to do 1v here. We're seeing that things are changed, or that it's skipping those. I might actually have, no, there we go. We have this backup folder. So we see these backup folders are being created as it goes through the iOS XE devices and then the NXOS devices. So we can see we have 4 new folders there that were populated. And in each of those folders, we have this initial running config. Just a standard Cisco iOS config that we've gathered. We've placed them in the appropriate folders based on their host name. So now we have a baseline. We've done our first set of network automations. Our second step is talking, I'm going to cover a couple of things here. We're going to talk about tags, and we're going to talk about check mode. So I'm not going to do any complex configuration here. I'm just changing NTP servers. Very simple, because I don't want to get lost in configuration. I want to focus on Ansible. So I'm going to be changing some NTP servers. I'm going to configure these servers. I have a list of them, so I'm going to be using this item. I'm going to loop across the NTP server, so we're going to apply 2 to our configuration. And I'm going to say state merged. So whatever configuration exists there, don't replace it, just merge with what I'm adding to it. So if I have 2 there already, I will now have 4. I've also tagged this with deploy. The tags are very powerful. So what that means is when I call an Ansible playbook, I can segment it by tags. In fact, if I scroll down, I have 1 for deploy, and I have 1 for clean. If I call the Ansible playbook with that tag deploy, it will only follow the task that is tagged with deploy. If I call that same playbook with the tag of clean, it will follow the task that has the clean tag attached to it. So I have one Ansible playbook that can both apply and remove NTP configuration. Not only that, because I have repeated these things, I have an Ansible playbook that will deploy and clean on iOS and deploy and clean on NXOS. So I've been able to create one playbook to work on multiple devices to move forward and reverse. And if you look, probably when you have the code, because this is a real small window, all I've done between the two is change from state merged to state deleted. Everything else is the same. I've just changed my state. So I've had a lot of reuse here to create that same task. So what I'm going to do first, playbook 20 tags.yaml, -- tags, and we're going to do deploy, and I'm going to use this capital C. How many folks have heard of check mode before with Ansible? Check mode is a really well-kept secret. But what this --C means is reach out to the device, interact with it like you would be creating that configuration, but don't actually apply anything. Report back if something would change, but don't do anything otherwise. So it's like a two-stage thing. I can see, are we going to make changes before I actually make the changes? So I'm going to do this -C, and before I do that, I'm going to log into one of these devices, clear, and I'm going to Cisco at 176. Oh, I forgot to do this, so 1 second. $315. Little Vim tricks that came in my last session. So we're on this distribution router 2. I'm just going to do show run and include NTP to show you that there's no NTP servers. I'm going to run this playbook in check mode, And I should have these variables. It should apply 10, 10, 20, 100, and 101. Those are the NTP servers that should be called. So you can see that it's skipping the devices that don't apply, the 170. It's iterating for all the devices, but it's skipping the ones that don't apply based on that conditional matching. And it says that these things have changed. So we've changed and we've added these things to our network device. But if I go back, and run that same command, we don't have any NTP servers. So we saw that Ansible was going to change that configuration, but it didn't actually do so. Now, if I run this without the -cap-c, I hit deploy, we'll see the same output as we saw before, but in this case, we'll see that we're actually, now that's unexpected. At least NXOS has changed. Let's see if it actually applied here. Let me exit out of here. I wonder if they changed some of the... You can see that we've at least configured some NTP servers there. I don't know why I was getting that weird output there. The modules may be out of sync or something like that. But we've added those configuration changes there. So now we've done check mode as a 2-stage, and we can see that we've added those things. Now let's run the same command and let's do a delete. So instead of deploy, we'll do tags clean and hit enter. And this will run through, skipping where appropriate. And when we log back into the NX, or when we go back to our SSH window for the NXOS devices, we can see that those will then be removed. So just by switching the tag that we've applied to our playbook, we've gone forwards and backwards, and all we've done was change that state. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit real quickly is precedence. So we saw that we had several NTP servers that were defined in a variables file. However, you also see that in this new playbook, I have NTP servers defined with the same name, NTP servers, in my playbook itself. Part of compliance is also making sure that you follow standards on where you put things. Ansible has a ton of different places that we can put variables. How many people think there's more than 5 places you can stick a variable in Ansible? More than 5. Okay, since no one raised their hand, there's actually 23 ways that you can call variables in Ansible. In fact, if you do a search online for Ansible variable order of precedence, there's a document where it lists all 23 locations of where variables can be inserted. And just like BGP or any other thing that or election that happens, some are more precedent, some have higher value than others. So in this case, if I run this playbook, and again, I haven't changed anything aside from the names. It's the same as the previous. I have those tags deploy, and I have tags clean. Let's call that 30 playbook. So Ansible playbook, 30 precedents, tags VV deploy. I'm not going to do check mode this time because I'm going to get the output that I want. And you can see here, just based on that output, it's applying 3333 and 4444, not the ones previous, because the variables in the playbook outrank the variables in a vars file. So just be aware of where you put these. I might need to update that. Where these things update, or where these things are being called from to make sure that you see them. So if we go back here to that Nexus switch and do a show run INTP, I have 3333 and 4444. It didn't even look at the variables with the other name because it said these two variables have the same name, NTP_servers. They match. I'm going to choose the one in the playbook. So just something to be aware of. Not necessarily compliance, but be aware. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on is configuration rendering. Okay. Like I talked about earlier with Ansible, is I want to use Ansible to automate my network. But for approval to make that change, I probably can't submit an Ansible playbook because the old guys in the room, the old network engineers are going to say, no, I'm used to CLI. I want to see the actual commands you'll be applying. I don't like this Ansible stuff. So you have to do one of two things. You either have to copy and say, this is what I want in my Ansible playbook, and it's going to do this in my iOS configuration, which is fine. But the other thing is, how do I know that I've configured my playbooks the right way? How do I know that I'm going to get that expected output? And that's where configuration render comes in handy. So all I've done here is I've changed this state to rendered. Not all modules have this, but all of the Cisco iOS and NXOS and iOS XR have them. What this says is, instead of applying a configuration, just spit out the configuration that you would apply if you were to run this playbook. So what I've done is I've done the same thing. I have the state rendered, but I've used the tags deploy. So we'll go ahead and go back to this. Oops. Where'd I go? Terminal. There we go. Go back here to Ansible playbook, 40 render. I'm going to do tags deploy. The thing about using the rendered configuration is you must have at least 2 Vs. I don't know why, but you have to have at least 2 Vs. Otherwise, it'll just say everything's good and won't spit any output to standard out. So you need to have the 2 Vs in order to see it. So it's going to spit out the configuration. It's not going to actually change anything, but you can see here, and it looks better the more Vs you have, it'll start blocking that configuration out, and I'll show that in a second. But you can see this configuration line right there, NTP server 10.10.2101. So it's taken the Ansible playbook and rendered it into output configuration. There's a caveat with that. There's one problem. Rendered, so when we've talked about doing the delete action, I've used state deleted, correct? Normally that's a no statement, but sometimes there are other things that get in the way. I cannot have 2 states simultaneously. So even though I have different tags here for clean, if I run this same command with tags clean, I'm not going to get the no. I can't remove it because that requires state deleted. So there is a little bit of a gap there where you could run this, and I'll show you that with this here. Oops. We'll do tags clean. Again, because I cannot have multiple states defined there, the output is still going to be that NTP server blah. Now you may say, Quinn, that's fine. I appreciate that, but it's an NTP server. It's nothing complex. What about route maps? We all love BGP, right? We all love route maps. Sometimes they're very complex. It's even more complex if we want to talk about how we do this in Ansible, because does Ansible interpret things the right way, or are we interpreting Ansible the right way? So at the very bottom of this, I have this prefix list for just some IPv4 networks for iOS and iOS XE. So I've got some sequences, I've got some actions, I have some mask matching there, greater than equal to 24. I've got some prefixes there. So this is a very complex thing. And did I do this right in Ansible? Because I don't want to break our BGP relationships. We don't want to bring down the internet because then people will scream. So I have given this with a separate tag of prefix, and we will show what happens when we render that, and I will also add an additional V. So I'm going to do 3 Vs, tag prefix. So there's my prefix tag, and I've added that extra V, and we'll see a much cleaner output here. I'll run that. And you can see here, under the state rendered, I have pulled out that entire prefix list. And so now I can say, does this match what I intend it to do? Do I have my prefix and my mask lengths matching? Do I have the right sequence numbers? Is everything in order? But on top of that, once it's good and I've designed it in the Ansible playbook, I copy and paste this into my document. I submit this for the change. And now I know that when I run this playbook, I will get that exact same output applied to my devices. So that's where rendered config comes in handy. Now we're at the bottom of the hour. We're out of time. The other things that I cover are roles, which is a larger automation, and show how I've got tags with roles, so you can have selective application of these things. And then the final steps, I do another backup after we've made a bunch of changes, and I show you how to do a diff. All of that's included in the code README. I'll bring that back up here if you haven't got a picture. I will be around for the rest of the event over here in our demo booth. If you have any questions about Ansible, I would be remiss if I did not remind you that while on site, if you are interested in Ansible and want to take an exam that covers Ansible, you could take our DevNet Associate, our EN Auto, our Dev Core exams, all of which include Ansible, upstairs in the testing center for 75% off, 25% of cost, so 75 off. And if you have any questions about our learning paths or certifications, feel free to stop by. And our final item is under one of your chairs, there is a hanging keychain, so underneath. If you have this, come up and see me for a prize. Thank you.